Do you all remember being children in school? You don't have to answer. I already know that you remember. I'm talking about all the other old people in the room, the adults in the room. Do you remember being children? I remember going through the first day of school jitters. Did anybody else get those? The first day of school jitters. You show up to school, and there's just some uncertainty. Right now, it's fun because all of your friends are back, right? Or at least most of them, those that hadn't moved on to other places for various reasons. There are also new kids to meet and to see, right? And to gain new friends and new experiences. But I don't know, I had those first day of school uncertainties, those jitters that I just couldn't get out of my head sometimes. But I remember going to each classroom, and I don't know if Jim did this or not, but I remember going to pretty much every classroom, and in the class, the teacher had that information sheet that you had to fill out. Did any of your teachers do that? You had to go and you had to fill out an information sheet. They asked you a bunch of questions. What's your name? Or what do you want to be called? Who's your favorite pet? You know, those sort of things. Does nobody else have that? All you Northeasterners, man, y'all are weird. In Texas, my teachers actually cared about me. Yeah. So fine. Okay, maybe my school was just unique in that. Geez, all right, well, none of you can relate to this. Well, let me tell you, I had to go to my classes. This happened every year. And each teacher wanted to know, it was about half a page. It wasn't anything outrageous. But I remember sitting down in every class and having to fill out, there was that place of, what do you want me to call you? You know, because not everybody goes by their first name, or maybe they go by a nickname, something like that. The teacher wanted to get it right. I thought that was nice. Then they'd ask questions like, again, do you have a favorite pet at home? Do you have a favorite food? A favorite place to go visit? Things like that. You know, things to get to know us. I thought it was a really charming way to get to know, for the teacher to get to know their students. I thought it was really, really great. There was always one question on every single form, though. And when I got into high school, middle school and high school, and you have a bunch of teachers throughout the day, I had to answer this over and over and over again. What do you want to be when you grow up? Now, whether you got that on a first day of school form or not, how many of you remember answering that question over and over again as you were growing? Okay, yeah. So now I'm seeing some nods. Good. So we're not totally out of sync this morning, just mostly out of sync this morning. What do you want to be when you grow up? For years, I answered that question. Years I answered that question, never knowing that I would end up in Danbury, Connecticut. I mean, if you had asked me when I was a young child, New York felt as far away as London. I had no idea of what it would be like to move somewhere so different from where I grew up. Maybe, as a young kid, I probably couldn't even have located Connecticut on a map. Definitely not Rhode Island. We get asked that question, or a variant of it, many times as we grow. What do you want to be when you grow up? What do you want to do with your life is another way we hear it. Another way of asking it is, who do you want to be? So after you've selected your field of study, if you go to college, or after you've begun your apprenticeship or trade program, if you go into something like that, the question shifts a little bit. How did you choose this or that field that you're in right now? What made you go into this program that you're focused on at this part of your life? Another way of phrasing that question is, who are you and how did you come to choose this? That question actually often haunts a lot of people. They don't like to hear it, much less to answer it, as there are a lot of people who felt pushed into the field that they go into. They felt forced into it. Their mother or father is a doctor, so they end up becoming a doctor. Their mother or father is a lawyer, and they push them into becoming a lawyer. Maybe that's not really where their passion lies. Others get extremely excited about that question because, and you've talked to people like this, they can't help but talk about the thing that they do. That's like all they ever want to talk about because they're so excited to talk about what they do. You met those people before? They can be annoying, can't they? But it's great to see that passion on their face, to hear it in their voice, right? There's something that they're so in love with, this thing that they get to do. It's really great to see. And a question often asked alongside this idea that I'm talking about is, when did you know you were meant to do what you were doing? When did you discover that moment that you knew this is what I'm going to do for my life? I think a lot of people can say, well, it became confirmed in me when others around me started affirming within me that they see that I'm headed for this sort of thing. I remember, I probably kept you in suspense. The way I always answered that question growing up, until about my junior year of high school, was I wanted to be a police officer. That's what I always wanted to do. I wanted to go to the University of Texas. I wanted to study law, and I wanted to be a police officer. That's what I wanted to do. And then this thing happened at church where all these people started coming up to me randomly and telling me, you should go into ministry. I see you going into ministry. No. I pushed them off. I brushed them aside. I told them no to their face. I'm not doing that. I have my plan set out. I know what I want to do. I'm passionate about this. I don't want to do that. But I kept being told over and over again, you should go into ministry. We really see you going into ministry. And eventually I couldn't ignore it anymore. And so my answer began to change for that question. When others start confirming around you what they see in you, it can often change how we feel about ourselves. I think Jesus is in just this sort of moment that we're about to read in Luke chapter 9. So he's been on the road traveling, doing ministry, healing people, teaching and preaching all over the place. He's even heard the voice of God already and seen the Spirit confirm his calling. But now others are beginning to see who he truly is. And it's this moment of confirmation for him when Peter stands up and says, you are the Christ. That I think it really is driven home for Jesus. Okay, now others are confirming within me what God, what my Father, what the Spirit has already told me. Others are beginning to see the work I'm doing and confirming it within me. There's something very powerful in that moment. And I don't want us to miss just how powerful it can be. So turn to Luke chapter 9 if you want to read along. I'll be reading, of course, and it'll be up on the screen for us. Let's read here and see what happens in this story. The word of the Lord from Luke's Gospel. One day, Jesus left the crowds to pray alone. Only his disciples were with him. And he asked them, who do people say I am? Well, they replied, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, and others say you are one of the other ancient prophets risen from the dead. Then he asked them, but who do you say I am? Peter replied, you are the Messiah, the Christ, sent from God. Jesus warned his disciples not to tell anyone who he was. The Son of Man must suffer many terrible things, he said. He will be rejected by the elders, the leading priests, and the teachers of religious law. He will be killed, but on the third day he will be raised from the dead. Then he said to the crowd, if any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross daily, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but are yourself lost or destroyed? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in his glory and in the glory of the Father and the holy angels. I tell you the truth, some standing here right now will not die before they see the kingdom of God. About 8 days later, Jesus took Peter, John, and James up on a mountain to pray. And as he was praying, the appearance of his face was transformed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared and began talking with Jesus. They were glorious to see, and they were speaking about his exodus from this world, which was about to be fulfilled in Jerusalem. Peter and the others had fallen asleep. When they woke, they saw Jesus' glory and the two men standing with him. As Moses and Elijah were starting to leave, Peter, not even knowing what he was saying, blurted out, "Master, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." But even as he was saying this, a cloud overshadowed them and terror gripped them as the cloud covered them. Then a voice from the cloud said, "This is my Son, my chosen one. Listen to him." When the voice finished, Jesus was there alone. They didn't tell anyone at that time what they had seen. All right. So the question on our minds, on everyone's minds at the time, who is Jesus? This question is even on Jesus' mind. Who do you say I am? Who am I? Jesus is asking of them. So let's talk about Peter's confession here to begin with. We already know, as I said earlier, that Jesus' initial confirmation came at his baptism. It was there, we presume, that Jesus first heard God's voice audibly. It was there that the Holy Spirit alighted upon him and additionally confirmed Jesus' role as God's chosen person. Luke also has given us hints that prior to Jesus' baptism, he had at least some idea that the life that he was leading was going to be different than other children his age, as he debated the leaders, the scholars in the temple itself. There was something different about this boy, even before his baptism. After his baptism, his ministry launched, and it looked different than people were expecting it to look. It sounded different than they expected it to sound. Jesus did and said things the Messiah wasn't supposed to do and say, at least according to their understanding of the Messiah. Now, equally frustrating was the fact that he wasn't doing any of the things that they actually did expect for him to do and say. He wasn't building an army to rival Rome and drive them out of their homeland. He wasn't challenging Herod and his false rule as king over Judea, which they were hoping he might do. Instead, he was confusing every religious leader he came across, or just about every religious leader he came across, every Pharisee. He confused them to no end, those who were supposedly on the lookout for the Messiah. He even confused John the Baptist, as John himself sends his own disciples to Jesus to say, "Who are you? You're not doing anything like I thought you were going to do. How can you be the Messiah?" He even confused John the Baptist. And so all of this confusion, every bit of it, made pinning down who Jesus was a pretty difficult task. It's easy for us to look back and go, well, of course he's the Messiah. But at the time, they're thinking, no Messiah is supposed to act like this. This can't be the Messiah. And yet Peter figures it out. So instead, what did they do? They proclaimed him a prophet, which we talked about last week. Nothing wrong with being proclaimed a prophet. A very good thing, in fact. And so they ran the gamut of the prophets that he modeled, from Moses to Elijah to even John the Baptist himself. It was clear to the people who were witnessing him that the things Jesus was doing and saying were powerful, godly even perhaps, and maybe even correct. They're just not Messiah-like. They couldn't quite nail down exactly what they thought about him. So maybe he's just one of the prophets. And so I think perhaps this interested Jesus a little bit. What really interested him, though, was, of course, what his own disciples, his own followers, thought about him. Jesus was more than just someone through whom God was working at that particular moment. He knew that. But he wanted to know if they knew that. Jesus was the literal game changer who had come to earth. He hadn't come to point them to God. He had come to show them God in the flesh. And that's a very different sort of thing than a prophet did, than a priest did, who could only point from themselves to God. Jesus could say, no, when you see me, you are seeing God in the flesh. And as I read this story again this week, I focused on characters I'd never thought about before. For me, this has always been a Peter-centric story. Both of these stories have always been about Peter for me in my mind. I don't know why. I tend to gravitate toward him, maybe because I, like Peter, am quick to run my mouth sometimes, and too long. But this confession to me has always been about Peter. But this week I found myself thinking about James and John and Bartholomew and Matthew and all the other disciples who were with Jesus. Now, we don't hear their reactions when Jesus is asked. We actually don't get any of their reactions, but we get Peter's response. And I wonder what they thought. Did they agree with Peter? When Peter made his confession, you are the Christ. It's you, the one we've been waiting for. Did they sit back and go, all right, Peter, what are you seeing that we're not seeing? Let's have a philosophical discussion about this, shall we? Let's sit down and reason together. Were they more hesitant than he was to answer and to agree with him? Was Peter actually right? Maybe Peter's wrong. Could Jesus really be the one they'd been expecting when everything he was doing was unexpected? Could he really be the Christ? I thought about the disciples this week. And this confession by Peter, and let's go ahead and presume the other disciples agreed, though we don't have any proof of that. While it's a great confession in and of itself, it doesn't end the conversation. Because what does Jesus say about following him? Is it going to be easy to follow Jesus? Are you going to have a life of everything you've ever wanted? Does Jesus promise to give you the moon and all the world? No, of course not. He says this is going to be the most difficult thing you've ever done. Following me will lead to your death. Following Jesus will mean not putting yourself first. It will mean putting His needs and His desires first. It will mean sticking by Him even when things get really difficult, and they're about to get really difficult. Jesus' demands on His disciples are about to be put to the test. Are they really willing to follow Jesus to death? And then we transition to this moment of transfiguration. I got to thinking about the transfiguration in a different way a little bit. I wonder how Jesus felt in His relationship to God on a day-to-day basis. Do you think He felt very close to Him? Do you think He was constantly on that mountaintop experience? Did He feel like many of us feel most of the time, that we know God is there, we believe God is there? A lot of the time, God just seems very far off, very distant from our reality, from our world, from our needs and desires. God doesn't feel like He's here with us. I wonder if Jesus felt like that too. We only know of one literal mountaintop experience that Jesus had, and it's this one in the Transfiguration. Though I think that Jesus must have felt very close to God on more than this one occasion. But it is a special occasion nonetheless. Something unique happened in that moment on that mountain. Jesus was physically changed before Peter, James, and John. As they were looking at Him, He physically changes. And also, they got to witness two men alive who had been dead for centuries. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill day. This wasn't your every Tuesday. And I don't know that until this time, reading through this story, that I'd ever caught what Moses and Elijah were actually talking about with Jesus. Did you pick up on it? Did you catch what they were talking about? Again, I don't think I had ever noticed it before. If you go read the story of Matthew, Matthew doesn't tell us what their conversation was about. All we have is a detail that he talked to Moses and Elijah. But Luke gives us more. What does Luke say they were talking about? They were talking about Jesus' departure from this world, about his exodus. I wonder if in that moment they were comforting him. Jesus knows ultimately where his end is going to be in Jerusalem, that he will die for his people. So were they comforting him, helping to mentally, physically, and spiritually prepare him for what's coming? I think that's highly possible. It can't be a pleasant thought in Jesus' mind that he'll have to lay down his life for the sin of the world. That can't be something that he, well, at least I suspect that he's not going into happily. We see him in the garden later on, suffering under such a command from God. And perhaps Luke's choosing this word isn't inconsequential. In the New Living Translation that I read from a few minutes ago, they translate the word literally from the Greek as exodus rather than departure, which many of your, if not all of your translations, change it to. They change it to departure. And so I decided to go look at the Greek. And in the Greek, the actual word there is exodon, which is a transliteration of exodus. It is the word for exodus. And I got to thinking, can that be coincidence? Is Luke just by happenstance using the word exodus instead of the more common word for, and he's going to leave? Maybe Jesus' exodus has a deeper meaning than just that he's going to die and leave this world. Maybe there's something in his death that connects back to that great exodus from Egypt. And not just the fact that he's speaking with Moses atop this mountain. Could it be that Moses and Elijah are hinting at Jesus that his death will be the way for humanity to cross over from death to life, as the Israelites had need to cross over the Red Sea from death behind them to life in front of them? Is it possible that Luke wants to conjure images up for us of Jesus in connection to Yahweh, who led his people by fire and cloud for 40 years, that Jesus now is the one leading us? As the people needed to have faith that Moses would lead them faithfully during the time of Exodus, Jesus' own disciples, us, need to trust him faithfully to lead us by his example. Jesus has already stated what the cost of being his disciple is. And even as Jesus is being filled up from this mountaintop experience, we all know it's not going to last. Now, I ended at verse 36, but I could have read on, of course. I don't know if you happen to get to read chapter 9, but the story that immediately follows Jesus this moment for Jesus, is he has to come back down from the mountain. And immediately he's thrust back into healing a demon-possessed person. He has to return to the valley. What's in the valley? Darkness, frustration, despair, suffering, people hurting. He can't stay on the mountain forever. He has work to do. Atop the mountain, he can clearly hear God's voice. The same is true for us. We can clearly hear God's voice that this is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him. Are we listening? Our weeks have kind of a cycle to them, which you've probably noticed. Maybe Sundays are our mountaintop experiences each week. Then as we go back into our jobs and our family life, maybe that's where our valley is. And it can be frustrating, and it can be hard and difficult to navigate the times that we're in the valley. It is dark. It can be depressing. There is suffering and hurt and pain. all the things that we don't want to deal with. We just want to stay on the mountain. Even Jesus has to come down. Even Jesus has to come down. So we have to stop trying to stay on top of the mountain. Listen to God's voice, and then go back. Go back and do just like Jesus did. Communicate God's will for His people. We have to listen. We have to be able to hear God first. We have to listen. I love Luke chapter 9. There's a lot more to talk about from 8 and 9, and we're going to do some of that on Wednesday night, so don't forget to join us if you want to join us on Wednesday night. We'll talk about some stuff that we didn't get to talk about tonight. But to close, I want to think about a couple of things for you to take away. The first is, are we acting faithfully on what Jesus said and not just thinking about it? It's one of those conundrums that we get into. We love talking about Jesus. All of us do, and I know that. We love talking about Jesus. We're really good at it. We're really good at defending Jesus if somebody says something against our faith. Really good at defending Jesus. We can yell at people till we're blue in the face about, no, Jesus is real, He's my Savior. That's great. It's not just about talking about Jesus. It's actually about doing. It's actually about faithfully doing what He wants us to do. Anyone can sit around and think about what Jesus said. There are lots of atheists who read the Bible and think about the things that Jesus said. What we have to do, what we need to do, is to act on them. Jesus finished His Sermon on the Mount a few chapters ago. He finished it by telling those who were gathered there listening to Him that day that listening to Him is good. But the wise person is what? The one who listens and does. Are we faithfully acting on what Jesus said that we should be doing? The second thing I want you to take away. Are we listening to the voice of God and where He's leading us? Are we truly sitting back and listening to God's voice? We have a tendency to drown God out. When God tries to speak to us, we just get louder, or we crank up the volume on something else so that we don't have to listen to God. We drown out His voice. Because sometimes it's easier to ignore Him than it is to listen. Maybe you need to spend some quiet time this week listening to God's voice. So we come to our family time now. A time in our service where we extend an invitation for you to come forward to let us know what's going on in your life, from the good to the bad, prayer requests, things that you are excited about that you want us to know about. We have this time of welcome and embrace for you, for anyone, to share what's on your heart, on your mind, so that we can be a family together in celebration and in sadness. And so if you have any need that you want to let us know about this morning, please come forward as we stand.